Hello and good morning from Oxford, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, wherever you're joining from today. My name is Jacob Dirksen, and together with my colleague Sebastian, I'll be hosting today's webinar. And on behalf of all co-organizer committee members, thank you very much for taking the time for joining us today, and welcome to this seventh and final webinar in our series on multidimensional well-being measurement. We're absolutely delighted that Sabina Alkire joins us today as the final speaker in our series with a presentation on limitations and frontiers, concepts, measures, and applications of the capability approach. Before I introduce our speaker and then hand it over to Sabina, just a few housekeeping related points. We'll have a presentation for about 40 minutes and then hopefully ample of time for a Q&A with all of you. You'll see at the bottom of your Zoom window here, there's a Q&A function where you can pop in your questions whilst we go along through Sabina's presentation. And you'll also have the opportunity to upvote others' questions if you'd like them answered. We'll also be able to allow some of you to unmute to ask questions directly if you like. So please first put your questions in the Q&A box if you have any, and then my colleagues in the back end will be able to directly contact you with an invitation to unmute. And there's also the chat function, which we won't use for question and answers, but for any other discussions. And for example, you can let us know where you're joining us from today, etc. So that's what the chat function is for. And a last housekeeping related point. So this session is being recorded, and the recording will also be made available later on. But neither the chat nor the Q&A are being recorded, so anything you put in there is not going to end up on any video. However, if you in the end do yourself unmute and ask a question, you'll also be on the video, so be aware of that. Okay, so I think our speaker today barely requires introduction, but I'll very briefly introduce her nevertheless. Sabina Alkire directs the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, a research center within the Oxford Department of International Development at the University of Oxford. And Sabina works on a new approach to measuring poverty and well-being that looks at clustered disadvantages. This multidimensional approach to measurement can consider overlapping challenges in health, education, nutrition, standard of living, work, and other valuable aspects of life. And with her colleague James Foster, Sabina devised a counting-based method for measuring multidimensional poverty that has been widely used by governments, international agencies, and other actors. And some of the most prominent applications of this method are, for example, the UNDP's Global Multidimensional Poverty Index or Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Index. Sabina has also participated in and learned from initiatives seeking to take a broader approach to well-being, such as, for example, the French Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, also known as the Stiglitz-Sanfilippo Commission, the UNDP's Human Development Report Office, the European Commission, the UK's Department for International Development, among many others. Sabina has also published very widely numerous articles and chapters on the capability approach, human development, poverty, and well-being. So we're truly delighted that Sabina is joining us as our final speaker today. Sabina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jacob. And thanks to all of you who have joined from so many different places and those who are watching asynchronously. It's really a delight to be here. And this community is one that remains close to my heart. It's one for which I have lots of respect and lots of admiration. So today, the title that I was given was Limitations and Frontiers, Concepts, Measures, and Applications of the Capability Approach. And my understanding is that this was to focus on well-being. But later when I got a lot of questions, they seemed to focus on multidimensional poverty. So I was a little bit confused of what to present. But also I noted that in previous seminars by many different authors that I enjoyed observing, there was a lot of discussion, and that was really the interesting part. So I will keep my presentation short to have lots of time for interaction and exchange, because I think that means that this might be tailored to the interests, at least of those on the call in these time zones. But I would like to begin by recognizing that we all, that we are all these days reading Amartya Sen's book, Home in the World. And there's a very fetching image that caught my attention, where he's remembering the Bengal famine 77 years before. And it made me wonder, what will be remembered of the capability approach and this generation of scholarship 77 years hence? How will the next chapter of research on the capability approach unfold? What big problems will we wrestle with and maybe be able to advance on? And that seems to be, in a sense, implicit in the question of what are our limitations and what are perhaps frontiers that invite research, that invite innovation and collaboration. Where have we come so far, and what applications are missing or they're still to be done? So that's, in a sense, the sense and the motivation for this very short exchange. And in terms of questions on poverty, Enrica Kieper-Martinetti, Muzaffar Kizilbash, and others very kindly suggested I just jot down some of the unanswered research questions on poverty. And those are in the book that they have published recently. So I'm going to begin with something that gave me pause. In 2009, as you will know, President Sarkozy invited Joe Stiglitz, Amartya Sen, and Jean-Paul Piccici to lead the Sarkozy Commission. And that commission explored the crisis of legitimacy of national statistics, primarily of GDP. And it looked into how to better improve GDP so that it was a slightly better metric for judging the economy. It also looked into adding sustainability and greening the GDP, or having other ways of recognizing the environmental costs and benefits so that the incentives align with those who are sharing the planet in a careful way. It also had a subgroup on quality of life, where it looked at 8 dimensions of the quality of life and advocated that these be considered and measured alongside GDP in the foreseeable future as a complement to have a more direct analysis of human situations and flourishing. And that Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi report, after a lot of debate with the subjective well-being literature that was dominant in the time, and that Danny Kahneman, Alex Krugman, wonderful psychologists and leaders in their field were also part of this community and that debate. It used the capability approach as the framework for the response, particularly in terms of quality of life. 10 years later, these 2 books were released at the 10-year anniversary of the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission report, Measuring What Matters. And one looked on well-being metrics beyond GDP, and the other looked at measuring what counts for economic and social performance. So both, in a sense, took this work to the next stage. What is interesting is that a lot of new literature and new people and new scholars were involved. But I must say that the work on capability that was evident in the first publication was not steepened. So the word capability was referred to just in passing in the For Good Measure book and not at all in the GDP book. And so there's a question that rises: has the capability approach had its moment in the sun, as it were? Or, as Ingrid Robbins said, is there still an articulation of nuance, of plurality, of diversity in the capability approach, that these new sets of techniques that are rolling out very fast empirically could still benefit from? And if so, how can that approach be articulated in a way that is not overly complex, that is more user-friendly? And how is that done without, of course, becoming an ideology or simply one person's idea? Another interesting exploration in the field of well-being, as you will know, was the IPSP report of the International Panel on Social Progress, a mammoth effort that gathered hundreds of academics to consider how we rethink society in the 21st century, how we understand social progress, and indeed how we measure it. Led by Mark Fleurbe at Princeton, it tried to articulate and bring together the emerging scholarship in the same sense that the International Panel on Climate Change had done earlier. And it's a beautiful and very deep and rich set of essays. And it articulated a manifesto for social progress, which put values front and center and called for a renewal of shared values. But again, it didn't necessarily engage with the capability approach, although some chapters very, very clearly did. So this again raises a question to which there's no answer. I'm not ideological, there's not a right or wrong answer. It's just a question of how does the capability approach add value? And how does it do so now, given that issues of multidimensionality, issues of well-being, issues of poverty in the SDGs recognized to be multidimensional are now not new ideas for the community, but they are sort of much more closer to the core aspirations of a, not all, but of a good proportion of academics working on these topics. I think in this different context, there are different kinds of demands that come on those who are doing research on capability and call for different ways of engaging the collegial literature and different ways perhaps of presenting the insights from this approach, because there are insights like the difference between achieved well-being and well-being freedom, or between agency and well-being, that are not perhaps as clearly expressed or explored in some of the others. So there might be nuances still to be engaged. And so this talk just seeks to think aloud, because it doesn't have one single paper behind it, about whether this period, when all of a sudden this work on multidimensionality and well-being now for a decade has been coming to the fore, whether we could find a different voice and a different way of engaging with these literatures and with each other in a way that could be quite productive for those on whose behalf we do this research. So one suggestion simply focuses on measurement, because it is one application of the capability approach that I know the thematic quantitative group on measurement has looked at a lot, but that also many of the other thematic groups, whether it's education or indigenous people or collective capabilities, have explored. And I can only speak from what I know. So with all its oversights, I'll speak about multidimensional poverty measures, and I'll speak about the methodology that they draw on. But the principles here, I think, might also be applied to other measures with other techniques behind them. And the question would be whether there might be some value in regularly linking poverty and well-being measures. And so recognizing that the capability approach seeks to expand capabilities, where these are understood as capabilities people value and have reason to value. And it seeks to expand them both in terms of well-being. So for somebody with very sophisticated tastes or needs, but also to give some kind of priority. And it's not clear how we articulate the particular priority, but it's clear that there is a priority for poverty. And so I'll discuss this using the Gross National Happiness Survey of Bhutan, because I think it might be interesting if we could link multidimensional poverty and multidimensional well-being measures. We would be able to see in far greater depth the profile of the humanity of the whole society. For example, we might be able to distinguish people who were poor and socially isolated from those who were poor and living in a rich and bubbling community, or those who were poor and bitter and angry about their circumstance, but also perhaps downcast or depressed, from the poor who are serene or peaceful or happy. And so distinguishing these different features of life that might not be central to poverty could be interesting, but it equally would be interesting to do for other segments of the society, the middle class, if you can use that term, or the upper part of the distribution. Who among them are socially isolated or struggling with anxiety? And that might also create an interesting channel of solidarity across people of very different socioeconomic, material statuses, but some similarities in community or in psychological well-being or in culture or in governance from belonging to the same countries or in time use, both being very busy, the destitute and the corporate lawyers. And so it would be interesting just to put it out there, to think of a set of academic studies very practically, but also just to sort of think of papers where we don't just do a paper on poverty or do a paper on well-being, but we do a paper overlapping them and then looking at other angles of commonality. And so we start to break down these divides. It's important to disaggregate by race, by ethnicity, by gender, by region, by age cohort. But disaggregation can also build up some kinds of assumptions that everybody within a category is the same. And so finding different kinds of categories and different commonalities of different indicators could be interesting. So let me develop this just briefly. The Gross National Happiness Index was developed by the Royal Government of Bhutan in 2008. And it has some interesting features. For each indicator, it asks what is sufficient to create the causes and conditions of well-being if a person has that achievement. How much is enough? People can get a PhD, but to be honest, you don't need a PhD. And clearly there's human diversity, but policy must aim at providing sufficient causes and conditions for well-being across a very diverse population. So it tries to articulate what those are. And it looks across a set of 33 indicators in 9 dimensions and looks at in what percentage of those 9 dimensions this person has achieved sufficiency. And it then applies different poverty cutoffs to group the entire society into different cohorts of being quote unquote unhappy, which is a name applied to people with less than 50%, or narrowly happy, or moderately happy, or deeply happy. But the word happy and the assessment that it is deep are external and cannot be validated. But the intention, and it could be used with different terms, is to categorize degrees of participation in the different indicators. And then you analyze those who are enjoying well-being, those who have a sufficient level. And the sufficiency is, of course, another value choice. You don't need to be a Renaissance woman to enjoy sufficiency in everything, perhaps, to enjoy well-being, because you might want to voluntarily not participate in some things. You might not need much sleep. And if time use and hours of sleep is an indicator, you might have less than 8, but it's not a deprivation. So, but above a certain threshold, there might be a sense that that person has achieved sufficient for well-being, and that cutoff needs to be validated by qualitative data, by participatory and self-report data, and looked at so we can understand the different typologies of human flourishing and how and where people flourish in different creative ways. So we can see an illiterate farmer who may be flourishing, as well as somebody in a small community of artisans or somebody in government service. And then for those who do not have sufficiency in a critical mass of indicators, there's a separate policy analysis of where the government or the private sector or the NGOs would need to invest efforts in order to catalyze the possibility of enjoying well-being. What is interesting in Bhutan is the recognition that at the end of the day, well-being is the project of the person, and any external institutions can only create the conditions to let education have an intrinsic value, for example. But it's up to the person themselves to go that last mile. So the other interesting aspect of the GNH index is that it's not just about individuals. So community vitality and being part of a vital community is also understood to be part of each person's well-being, where that community can be your family, your local neighborhood, or your nation, and questions at all 3 levels are asked. And it also includes the non-human environment, the other sentient beings, and the nature. So the GNH index has these different 9 domains, but because of that, it's not only about humans, but it's also about humans in community with each other and with the earth. So the GNH index then is disaggregated, as you might expect, by age cohort, by gender, by occupation, by district, there are 20 districts in Bhutan, by rural urban areas, etc. And it's broken down by the 9 domains and the 33 indicators. And these are studied over time to see what has changed. And then this GNH index, with all of the indicator detail, with their standard errors, of course, is presented at the district level to the different officials there. It's put online, it's translated. And there's a policy screening tool, a program tool, and also GNH certification for businesses. So ways that different institutions can assess the extent to which their activities align with GNH. So that's an example of a well-being metric, very clearly defined, as many could be, but it doesn't focus on the poor. And in this case, the original GNH survey does not have the questions required for poverty. But it can start interesting questions nonetheless about what has improved and what has not improved. So for example, when the GNH index was updated in 2015, there was an overall growth in GNH that was statistically significant. And it was driven by growth in all of the living standard dimension indicators, by an increase in access to services like water and sanitation and rubbish disposal, by an increase in the participation in cultural festivals, that's holidays, by more healthy days that people could work each week, and more hours of sleep. But as you can see, some of the indicators decreased statistically significantly. All of the indicators of psychological well-being, the perception of government performance, The sense that the Driglum Numsa, the value of courtesy, was important. The self-reported number of health, the healthy days increased, but self-reported health decreased. And so this, of course, creates an interesting conversation about the material advances, but also potential challenges in the well-being indicators that are more cultural, community, and psychological. And I seem to have lost my map. So my map that I was going to show you mapped the GNH index across all of the 20 districts of Bhutan. And there is also a slightly more recent multidimensional poverty index, which also is at those same 20 districts. And the GNH index districts are coded as less happy, middle happy, or high happy. And poverty, low poverty, middle poverty, high poverty, just for mapping purposes. And what is interesting is that the poorest 3 districts by the multidimensional poverty index included Dasa, which was the happiest of the 20 districts in Bhutan, a middle happy index, and a low happiness district. And so the poverty and the GNH score didn't have a high correlation. They didn't overlay at the same time. Rather, they pointed to different aspects of people's lives that were going well or that were a challenge at that time. And so this overlay is interesting in the same way that the diagram in front of us is interesting. And apologies for dropping the slide. Because it shows that the poor in Gasa did not have roads, did not have electricity, did not have secondary schools, lacked access to healthcare. It's a tundra. It's still many days walk to Lunana 11, 3 days walk to Laya. Many indigenous groups live there. But the culture is strong. The community is very strong. The income is strong because they grow cordyceps. And so they're not income poor. So there were interesting stories to be understood in comparison with the poorest district that was in the middle or the low happiness areas. So I think by doing these joined up studies, we will have a much more well-rounded understanding of the lives of the poor and of the lives of the non-poor. But these, of course, have strong data requirements. They're not out of reach. They're not as demanding still as a consumption survey. So the Gross National Happiness Survey is based on 124 variables. Most multidimensional poverty indices have between 39 and 70 variables. And most consumption questionnaires have 450 variables. So even a well-being plus a poverty, though of course some questions will overlap, so you'll save, would have 160 to 200 questions. So half of that of a consumption survey. So it's now out of range, but it's also not regularly done. So it might be an interesting frontier to explore that would deepen our understanding of the Sustainable Development Goals and the need for interconnections, the need to understand interlinkages at the lives of the people involved, but also the need to look at the positive aspects of lives that might be deprived in other ways and see what can be learned from them, or the deprivations of lives that might not require at this time policy support, but other kinds of investments could be beneficial. I'll briefly, because I noticed a number of people in these calls have been from Europe, I'll show you a good paper with a very preliminary measure that Fanny Govesti and I did just to explore the GNH methodology on a UK database. And we used the Understanding Society data from 2017 to 19. And we don't pretend that the indicators we used are right, but we wanted to illustrate the GNH methodology in a different data set. And conceptually, we looked at the concept of well-being in the UK government, and then we were not able to match all of the indicators. This is the National Wellbeing Dashboard for the UK, but we matched as many as we could. The black ones are matched, and the red ones are our approximations, insofar as we could do so with that Understanding Society survey, because the dashboard also draws on additional survey sources. And without going into the details, of course, we did some different measures with different weights and indicators because we were trying it out. But of course, when you have a well-being measure and then you disaggregate it, whether it's by age, whether it's by regions of the country, or as in this slide, by ethnicity, we were able to see different disparities that were thought-provoking. So I just mentioned here that the differences across self-reported ethnic groups, according to the survey categories, were quite strong, with 52.6% of those who self-identified as white enjoying favorable conditions of human flourishing or well-being, and only 34.5% of those who identified themselves with a non-white category. Terminology is problematic, I recognize that, but we are using the survey terms. So this is really an invitation to take existing data sets, to reanalyze them, to do, it doesn't have to be a perfect measure, but a poverty and a well-being measure, and then to match the household ID and look at different assessments of poverty and well-being for different people. Now, I'd like just to also mention, because this talk of limitations and frontiers seemed to invite several different suggestions and not just a single one. So I thought I would just take a few minutes to touch on some of the other areas that might be of interest in terms of new work. And in doing so, I'm also picking up on some of the conversations I've heard in the previous seminars. Alex is on contextualization, or Jaya Krishna Kumar, Julia Greco, and Enrica Chiaperos on the weighting issue, or Jose Mangroche is on the overall approaches. But a question which has come out very strongly, both in the surge of work on subjective well-being and on mindfulness, and in the pandemic, has been the emergence of new variables like mental health or mindfulness as a way of addressing depression, anxiety, pain. Compassion comes up in some, but also the pain of social isolation. And then, of course, the wonderful studies of evaluative life satisfaction and happiness. And there's been a lot of work in the capability approach to explore the relationship between these more interior, internal, subjective, self-report mental states and capabilities, starting with Luigi Bruno and his work on happiness and capabilities, and with many, many others contributing to this exercise. But I think that it would be interesting to re-explore this, because it clearly will be an area coming out of the pandemic of a great deal of investment, including by policy actors and by NGOs. So first of all, we recognize that if you think of these in terms of capabilities, that they clearly have an intrinsic value. It is better to have a mindful state of interior peace than a great deal of anxiety. But they are also instrumentally useful in terms of productivity, in terms of cold absenteeism from work, or ability to care and share with others in the household and personal communities. And they also influence the wider collective capabilities. The institutions or communities one is a part of are influenced by the mental states of different people. And so positive and negative emotions will also affect the wider communities, how much time is spent simply on managing emotions versus on other kinds of collaborative work-based activities on a team, for example. Elise Klein did a fantastic doctoral thesis on internal empowerment, different understandings of confidence in people in Mali, recognizing that it is not just external actions of being empowered, but it's also your confidence, your motor to get up and go and to make change. That this interior aspect is vital, but often overlooked and under-nurtured by those who wish to support empowerment. And again, many in the HDCA have done fantastic work on this thread. So the question is how these can be brought together with, in a sense, the work of expanding capabilities. And it might be that you think you just fall in love, like you fall into a swimming pool. And you also might think that you're just happy or you're not happy, like you're in a swimming pool or you're not. And it's not within your control. But I think a lot of the research is also observing that these can be learned. You can train your mind, emotional intelligence or different ways of supporting social states. It's not to say that that's enough, because clearly a social isolation also requires friendship, community, safety, concern. But there might be an aspect of internal training that complements the external environment. And so this is very delicate, very dangerous territory. But there might still be possibilities of not avoiding it, but bringing it into the conversations. And so the quest would be to specify in greater detail, now given the huge amount of research in this area, the relationship between internal and external capabilities. You don't want to make somebody happy with their poverty. And Amartya Sen was very clear on that. You don't only want to be judged by utility. But there might be ways of supporting both and supporting and nurturing the expansion of both. And this could be done, obviously, in some cases by the usual policies that we think about, but it also might be interesting to do in management or in business context. And this is quite interesting. In a paper that I co-authored with Alexandra Fortas, we looked at some of the management books that are coming out. It was a background paper for the Human Development Report called Human Flourishing on a Shared Planet. And we observed that some of these books, all of which, by the way, mention the capability approach, are also trying to understand how to cultivate these positive mental states or to use them to manage in a self-conscious way, a conscious leadership, and these kind of terms are used. But that this literature only used the capability approach when it was talking about policies, mainly focused on material things, and then it switched to a psychological language when it was focusing on the others. So it might be interesting in terms of a frontier, and I know some people are already working in that area, but to continue that work and line of activities. Naturally, missing data remains something that I think all speakers in this seminar have talked about. And it remains an issue despite a data revolution, despite the proliferation of big data, of geospatial data, satellite data, administrative data, techniques for merging data. And so there is a question about how, at this point in time, because it's always changing, the community that are trying to do better metrics, policies, work to advance capabilities could use these data, but also curate them in a way that was appropriate for scholars that are taking a multidimensional approach. And it would be a very natural area to focus on. I think the ideas are quite obvious that I put on the slides. I just wanted to landmark it because I think it's very important. And the final point that I wanted to really bring up is about the participatory aspect, which has been a core and very passionate part of many scholars' work on capabilities approach, the use of participatory exercises, of focus group discussions, of now online interfaces to understand well-being or poverty from the view of the protagonists, to understand the normative value judgments that different people might make, to understand the diversity of views, and so try to recognize and let all of one's research be informed by what people value, and in a very clear way articulate how each research activity is designating what people might have reason to value. So this is an example from El Salvador of a fantastic study Jimmy Jimenez did with UNDP on how poor people in communities were articulating their deprivations and linking their words to the indicators of the national MPI in that context. So it was one way of that can be facilitated, it can be manipulated, it can be depersonalized. We know the potholes, but it was really trying to ground indicators in a respectful understanding of the deprivations people articulated. But there is a problem in interfacing, and I think I've lost my slide here again, with the research users. So it continues to be the case that the only activities that I know of, and I could be clarified, where people provide data and immediately understand the data and how it applies to them, tends to be with NGO work and small scale work. And that most national statistics work that are using standard surveys or data collection of a different sort, but that is used for regular purposes, regularly updated. They often simply grab data from somebody as the participant, the respondent, the informant, but don't return the analysis to them. And it would be very interesting now with the possibilities we have by apps, by cell phones, by CAPI, by tablet-based data collection, to really invest in many, many different ways and explore many different avenues by which that interface between the enumerator and the respondent could be made much more humane, where the respondent could propose new questions that were overlooked. It could see how the data were being analyzed and offer their perspective. And it could, so that it could become a tool for conversation and shared ownership. Again, there are many interesting explorations in this way. The Fundación Paraguaya is one, and many in the participatory group have already done that in your own fieldwork. But I think it still needs to find its moment in the limelight in terms of standard data collection techniques. And it's something that I think would be interesting, because then work on capabilities would have an interesting angle of interpretation, of diversity of perspectives, and of quantitative data in one kind of conversation. So it's not easy. If it was easy, it would have been done. But I think that it is something with the technology that we have now that should be able to be, somebody will do it and be able to go large scale in the next few years. So that's what I really wanted to just suggest as some limitations and some frontiers in terms of conceptualization, in terms of measurement, in terms of some applications. And I'd also like to observe, going back to our first question, that there's also a question about collectivity of research, collective research and individual research. And we certainly now appreciate interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity and collaboration. And this webinar has been a fantastic example where the organizers have been very much a team. And yet, despite that, there's also the concern that if too much is collaborative, it could become an ideology. It could become paternalistic. It could become something that we would not wish to impose on others. And so a question, again, to this community, given that there is a centrality of interest in issues of well-being and of multidimensionality, and given that this window will not be open forever, how can research be done in a way that genuinely turns the tide, but does not fold in to another ideology or another something that's too narrow? And there's need for compromise, and there's also need for alertness. And so it's a question really to ask. I know years ago I was interested in looking at multidimensional approaches to economic well-being and to trying to think of it in a very shared space across many disciplines and across many years. But it's difficult to do and to know how to do well. But I think some of these collaborations open the question of how this community might be able to take some of the space and some of the voice and add something genuinely useful going forward, particularly about agency, multidimensionality, value, and having reason to value. So with that, I will conclude. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sabina, for such a comprehensive and clear presentation. We already have a few questions in the Q&A box, and I'll just encourage everyone else who still has some to pop them in there so that we can sort through them as well. I'll just see if we have some of the participants already willing to also unmute. Maybe we can start with Travis, if that's all right. Travis Chamberlain had a question. If Travis is able to unmute and directly ask the question.
Jacob, you have to give me a minute to find him.
Yeah, sure. There he is, Travis.
Yeah, hello, Dr. Alkire. Thank you for your presentation and really so many thoughts. I think a resonance that has carried across the entire webinar series continues into the present moment. One question I have listening to your Bhutan GNH mapping example is that you mentioned there were some areas that had the most quote unquote poverty, but still had strong scores in happiness, including metrics associated with psychological well-being. And a theme of this series has been how to authentically account for how people, especially stakeholders, really value different kinds of well-being. So which indicators would be the most important to them in their context, as opposed to, say, most important to a technocratic committee or a government body that seems to be making a decision. And you just talked a lot about the value of participatory methods and trying to give stakeholders and people a chance to reflect on what's important and whether or not the measure actually captures what they find to be important. So I'd like to ask, in your experience, what kind of methods are going to continue to carry us forward? You kind of suggested, but I wonder if you have some concrete examples that you think will continue to help researchers and people working in NGOs and practitioners to really give people voice and influence about what they value in their context.
Thanks so much, Travis. That's a great observation. In Bhutan, there's also confusion about what is gross national happiness and how does it relate to me. So this year, the team at CBS that do the survey are also doing qualitative interviews. And so they're sitting with people and talking with them about their own self-understandings, as I mentioned, of their own situation, whether or not they self-identify as enjoying a flourishing life, and how they articulate that flourishing. And the group will then be coming up with a series of profiles of different typologies of well-being, because they want to showcase to the community, in a sense, that there are a diversity of legitimate ways of being and doing well. So last time in 2015, the G&H report observed that the 20th happiest people were men and women. They were aged 17 to 47. They were in urban and rural areas. They were a corporate lawyer. They were an illiterate farmer. They were a government employee. They were a small herder. It looked at how they were frustrated. You know, the very happiest person still had some anger, still felt they didn't have belonging in their community. Somebody else felt that Driglum Namsa, the values of courtesy, were going down, but they were very flourishing in other ways. Others didn't sleep enough. And so understanding sort of the objective profile and then their interpretation of it, and then whether or not and why they are flourishing is interesting. I'll end just with one little story. We went back to one man who was among the happiest 20 and visited him 2 months ago, and just to see who he was. And it turns out he's a poet. And so the interview went on for hours and hours. Much poetry was recited and enjoyed, as well as food, as you can imagine. And it was just seeing the beauty of this person's life, and that you couldn't get from the objective score. We had no idea he was a poet. That was not what he put as the profession. But getting these little cameos of diversity that people, in a sense, themselves articulate, and then if there is data, they've all also interpreted the data. I think that's one way of then trying to offer to the wider community, not saying these are the only typologies of flourishing, but these are some. Tell us your own, you know, so write in, and we'll be putting a shortened form, I think, of the G&H questions. Facebook is what's used there, so people could, you know, think of them and use them. It's a moment to say to this gathered community that if people are particularly interested in Bhutan, and if they are quite humble, because it's not a society that can do with a lot of academics coming to do their work and brag about it, but then there would be opportunities for collaboration there.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Travis, and thanks, Sabina, for the answer. Next, I'll give the word to Jürgen, who had a question, and I believe is able to unmute now and ask the question directly.
Thank you very much, Sabina. Can you hear me?
Yes, lovely to hear you, Jürgen.
Okay, great to hear you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question which deals with issues which you have together, and you also have elaborated years ago. When we talk about, in a way, bringing together happiness and capabilities and MPI, we know from you also that we have missing dimensions. For example, labor. So my question would be, how far are we in this? Because as far as we know, there's missing dimensions. And of course, this may be a reason why what we do is not really getting us to the point where we want to be. So my question would be, is there any advance in integrating labor, let's say, into the MPI or something like that? Or how far are we in this important question?
No, that's a fantastic question, Jürgen, and we're also grateful for all of your work. In terms of a global MPI, it's a sadness for me. The DHS questionnaire has a question on work, but it doesn't know if the woman is in the labor force. And so it's not a question usually that we are able to use. And it would be wonderful if they could change the questionnaire, but that has not happened. But in Latin America, all of the national MPIs except Mexico, and Jacob's the expert on this, he tracks them, include some questions on employment in their MPI. Often they also include whether it is informal employment without protections. Sometimes it includes dependency ratio. Sometimes it includes not an employment, education, or training. Sometimes merely unemployment, sometimes underemployment. So there are different indicators that are used in different contexts, but that has become a fundamental dimension. And not only in Latin America, but in many other MPIs, if they have data for work from the same survey, that is a part of it. And that was also recommended by the Atkinson Commission, that articulated 6 dimensions that they thought should be in national MPIs, and work was one of them. So we are very much hoping that will become standard in many places. At the same time, we need to work with people like you to figure out which are the shortest but best employment questions. We have a problem of a 2-week recall period or 7-day recall period, and there's volatility. But a long recall period, then the question becomes long and expensive if people have had many jobs. So which are the best questions, the shortest questions? That's something where we still need collaboration and input.
Well, good to know it has started. Thank you very much. And we have started a labor group, right, in employment group in HDCA. So that may be also a place where we can do that. Thanks so much.
That would be great.
All of it sounds very excellent. Thanks for contributing with your questions and answers so far. I'd like to invite PJ Mariano Capistrano next to ask a question. Please feel free to unmute.
Okay, good afternoon. Well, hello everybody from the Philippines. It's late afternoon here. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Alkire, for that presentation.
Please just call me Sabina.
Oh, thank you. I will. My question is a bit self-serving, because as someone who works in the philosophical aspects of the capability approach, particularly on conceptions of responsibility for injustice within the approach and its applications, I'm curious what you think are or is the role of philosophers working in the approach in these new frontiers that you've described. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think, as ever, the role of philosophers is just thinking clearly about issues that others will stumble over. And when there is a clear articulation, for example, of duties, responsibilities, then it certainly will help to bring into different activities. And that's why I think there's a role for the very blue sky work. There's a role for the conceptual work. And then there's a role for the very, at the moment, highly applied work that I'm in at the moment. But I think that the gap of responsibility is a big one. And it's very difficult, particularly, for example, if you get to these inner capabilities, who's responsible for them? If there's childhood stories, if there's lots of, these are complicated things to sort out, and the person himself has responsibility, the wider society too. Teasing those out is important for budget allocation, it's important for programming, it's important for drawing lines that have to be drawn because they will, there are limited resources, and articulating which things really must have priority and why. So I think it's, to me, it's sort of saying the obvious, and I'm sorry if it's unsatisfying, but I think that value of thinking clearly. And when I look across the measurement work that I mentioned at the beginning, you don't have, as I mentioned, the clarity of understandings of agency, of how, there's an architectonic role, as Martha Nussbaum would say, of following Aristotle, of affiliation or a practical reason. All of these are so clear when you understand them. And when they're not part of this course, then it can be a little bit less efficient, the process of trying to measure and understand relationships between them.
Thank you very much. That's actually quite helpful. Thank you.
Thank you both. I'd like to ask a question that we have in the Q&A box on behalf of Clemencia Eugene, who writes, as I reflect on poverty, well-being, and quality of life, I think of the top causes of death, which in my mind is the ultimate measure of well-being / quality of life. Some of these are cardiovascular, strokes, respiratory disease, and communicable illnesses. Has there been any exploration of the HDCA with causes of death? Asks.
That's a great question to which I don't know the answer, so I'd like to put it out to this community. I'd only say the global burden of disease study is, of course, a go-to study that I think we all look at, because we can see who dies in a given year, what they die from, which are the preventable deaths. And so I'd like to ask anybody on this call, do you know the answer, or have you studied these causes of death? Because I don't.
Great. So if anyone knows an answer to Clementia's question, put it in the chat box, and then we'll all be able to appreciate that. I'd invite Mari Carrasco, please, next to unmute and ask your question.
Thank you, Sabina, for this great presentation, because I actually was working in Bhutan a few years ago for the Gross National Happiness Commission, and I was very into how we measure well-being for a multidimensional perspective. And now getting deeper in the concept for having the example of Bhutan and New Zealand, I'm trying to build up a framework for defining well-being as a broader, measure in the case of Chile, where I'm from. But then I come along with this limitation of the approach in terms of integrating the indigenous view, which is a non-anthropocentric view of well-being, whereas well-being, the capability approach is very anthropocentric. So the Maori's values, for example, that the river has come with rights, seems to be not very complementary or can be integrated into the capability approach in a rich way. So my question there is, if you think that it's a limitation, first of all, and if it's a limitation, how can you integrate, or if you have possibilities for integration of the indigenous view into the capability approach?
No, thank you so much. So I think, first of all, it's very interesting, 3 countries, Bhutan, New Zealand, and Chile. And in terms of Chile, I'm not saying it's perfect, but there was an interesting initiative by the current president, Piñera, about Compromiso País, where he set up roundtables for the different dimensions of their MPI, multidimensional poverty index. And the roundtables included, policy people, business people, academics who work on those things, and poor, deprived, or marginalized people who experience those deprivations, trying to do so in a respectful way. But it was an interesting experiment in terms of going around, and I'd love to hear your views on it. But in terms of the intrinsic value of non-human bits, I think that there would be people in the capability approach and in the environmental thematic group who have written on it and have looked at different ways it could come together. And I would also think, as Ingrid Robbins said, that not everything has to be from this approach. You can sort of mix and match where there is a really good, deep ecosystem theory that you would like to draw on. It certainly can be done. But there are writers in this community who have looked at the ecological. In the sense of Bhutan, or some places, as you will know, where people themselves give intrinsic importance to nature, then a human-centric approach that gives those people intrinsic importance will have to make some space for nature. And so that's, of course, the other way of acting on it, that doesn't then require everybody to have that same view, that intrinsic view, that rivers have rights, but it recognizes that part of the well-being of people that you do care about is this respect for the environment. And so that would be, a third angle of discussion. So that's just a few very random thoughts.
Thank you, Sabine. Yeah.
Thanks for the question, Mari. Next, we'll move to Shashi Motilal. Please, Shashi, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm talking from India. Thank you very much, Professor, for a wonderful presentation. My question is rather simple, which is that what role does religiosity play as an indicator of well-being. And I'm particularly interested in the the survey and the interviews that were conducted in Bhutan, and especially in the context of Buddhism, where those who follow that religion and the religious principles and the lifestyle, whether their well-being or their happiness really stems from subscribing to this particular religion or their being religious. So was this considered as an indicator in measuring the levels of well-being?
Thank you so much, Shashi. And I'm always aware that there will be other people who know more than I. I know Masoud Abano, I know Savarin Denulin, others have looked in religion and development for years. In terms of Bhutan, in the indicator of psychological well-being, there's one of spirituality, and it includes self-report. How spiritual do you consider yourself to be? It includes how often do you pray? How often do you consider the impact of or consequences of your actions on others? It's primarily Buddhist and Hindu, and so they can use the word karma because both faiths use that. And then how often do you meditate? So those are the 4 components of the spirituality indicator in Bhutan. You have a problem in that very spiritual people, out of humility, might say that they were not very spiritual. So that, I think, has been navigated successfully. But you do have to be aware that in some cultures, it would not be appropriate, even if you have a certain degree of attainments, to admit it, because it would be thought to be proud, and you should not do that. So religiosity is complex to study. It's also complex to study because of social expectations. If the survey is being overheard, or if there are conditions where to say something deviant would put one at risk, then you have to always think through those negative things. In fact, in both of the GNH surveys issued so far, they were not representative of the monastics. Western Bhutan is matriarchal, so there are many more monks than nuns because extra kids are sent to be monks and the women are kept. But among the monks that happened to be caught in the survey, they had very high happiness. And so this year there will be a special study that's representative of those populations to understand their well-being. Because in some senses we know that the sanitation is not so good, the heating is not so good, so some of the material conditions are not very good, but the mental conditions tend to be quite strong, but not always. So some folks are not so happy. So I think it's something to study, but so far the monks who have sort of made their final vows, because by the time they're 25 or 30, they'll have made their own choice to stay in, and they tended to be outliers in terms of their level of well-being.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shashi, for that question. Next, I would like to read a question from an audience member named Patricia, who writes, "Thank you to Sabina for such a rich presentation. Do you consider that MPI and well-being could be a good tool to dislodge, to challenge the realities and impacts of domestic abuse or domestic violence and intergenerational consequences of such matters?" In addition, Patricia writes that I'd be grateful for Sabina to provide the details of the work on internal empowerment she mentions. Thank you.
Great. So Elise Klein's work on internal empowerment was published, I think, by Routledge, and Elise is now at Australian National University. And so her website can be found, and it's Klein is the surname. Elise is the first name. In terms of domestic violence coming into a multidimensional poverty index, to my knowledge, it is not in an official index yet. I'm sure it will be after the pandemic. It was in a women's index that Yele Batana published for 8 African countries back in 2008. Of course, for violence, like for religion, you know, our first primary duty is to safeguard the safety of the respondent. And so domestic violence questions are put in surveys where the enumerators have special training and where there's care taken to who might overhear. And if there is a victim, what kind of support can be offered in a way that will not further endanger. So there are lots of things that have to be taken very seriously if you are going to put those questions into a new survey. But thinking about poverty and well-being measures, it could be very useful. I've been in participatory groups where it came up, raised by men as well as women, as one of the afflictions of their community that they wanted in their MPI. It wasn't later taken up at the national level. But that certainly is in some cases, a very prevalent, sadly, affliction and cause, and putting it in a measure would give it visibility. It would give it a kind of precision and ability to talk about it and to show trends over time. The question would be whether it sounds very odd, but if it is a very rare event, then it's still important, but it might look like a very low prevalence. And so in some countries, very sadly, it's not low at all. You know, 25% of the population, 50%, 40% of the population would live in a household which experienced domestic violence incidents. But in other places, if it's very low, then the indicator might look low. And you wouldn't want that to mean a diminution of the importance of that event for the people concerned. So I think it would depend, as everything does, on the context of the countries that you were, or the communities you were thinking to incorporate it in. But that would be useful because it is a kind of a deprivation which can have a stronger or less strong policy response. And so you're providing incentives and visibility to it so that there's celebration when it goes down.
Thank you, Sabina. That's a very informative answer, I think. Next on the line, I'd like to invite Ramakrishnan to unmute their microphone and ask the question live.
Hello, this is Ramakrishnan from India. So I just have one question, and the question is that, you know, would a single well-being citizenry database across the world help researchers in meeting the dangers of data-driven research questions? For one, as an Indian, it is very difficult as an economic student for me to collect data as well in such a large country, and I know how it would be for, you know, the rest of the world. And there are regional and cultural differences within my own country, let alone the differences across the globe. And as you said, environment plays a crucial role in determining the individual's well-being. So why not an online database that keeps track of an individual's well-being, capabilities, and accessibility? And for one, it might also help the researchers, and on the other hand, it might be handy for governments and institutions across the world to, you know, trace contact, to help in contact tracing in case of pandemics or any other virus outbreaks. So is it possible given the advent of artificial intelligence? Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Ramakrishnan. Yeah, so he was proposing an online database where people could upload their own data on well-being. And I believe that that is possible. In fact, James Foster and I are exploring that next month a little bit. We're trying to figure out if there's a possibility to have a short online survey for well-being, and what would be a short list of questions to put on it. If anybody has already done that, please send it to us. But we're looking obviously at Gallup and at World Values Survey and at the Afrobarometer, Latino Barometer, Social Weather Station in Manila, different sources of those kind of data, and then also at the standard household surveys that we know very well, to try to think of an online tool. And you could think like the My World survey had an app but they sort of pre-programmed, and you could only just select what your priorities were from a fixed list. But if there was a little survey, and if people were recognized, encouraged to apply, then the question would be if they answered accurately, which of course we don't know in terms of these kinds of data, how biased the sample was. If it required a smartphone, it will not be representative of certain communities in many countries. So there are lots of issues to be addressed that are important, and particularly in India, it would have to be done via SMS, not just a smartphone, I believe, in order to get some kind of data. But the question would be, what's the incentive to them? And so it would probably be somebody would need to pay for something, but then would they do it just to get the money, or would they actually share their inputs? And another incentive would be if they then got their own profile and they could look at their profile compared to others, maybe as a learning exercise, or if universities got into it. So I think it's certainly the time to be exploring these. I'm waiting for the first person to do the MPI app, a well-being app. You know, it's going to happen. And we just hope that when it happens, it will be a good one. And so that would be possible. I think very concretely, Ramakrishnan, you could also look at the India Human Development Survey and some of the other surveys at the state level, Andhra Pradesh or whatever, where they're rich data sets, but for a smaller population. And that might be one way to do a trial measure that's rigorous and uses existing data, and then also explore using other data sources that are rapid or remote surveys.
Great, thank you. I think we have maybe time for maybe 2 more questions. And first, I'd like to invite Abdullah to unmute and ask that question, please.
Hello, Sabina. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very happy to see you. You know, this is the 10th year of participation in measuring multidimensional poverty in Netherlands. On that time, I was working in Afghanistan. Now I'm in Canada, also doing the PhD, you know, using this approach. Thank you. Now, my question is that how measuring multidimensional poverty would deal this pandemic situation in theory and in practice. Theory means the dimension indicators, and in practice, yes, if you please answer.
Oh, thank you so much. I can only give a thumbnail because since March 2020, our team have been doing nothing but COVID response in terms of our work with countries. So it's quite detailed, but as a menu, some work was trying to simulate what might have happened in the pandemic. For example, using the Afghanistan National MPI, AMPI, we simulated potential increases to food security and to informal work. So Afghanistan's MPI has a dimension with 4 employment indicators in it. And in 2016-17, 51.7% of Afghani were poor by the national measure. And with the simulations, it would be 3/4 or more with any one indicator rising. And jointly, it could be higher, of course. So we did simulations. Then we did multiple vulnerability indicators, where we went back to existing surveys, which might have had data on overcrowding, on hand washing, on informal work, but these were not included in existing measures, and we included them. And the multidimensional vulnerability indices were used then at the regional level or rural urban level for targeting. Then where data were registry data or census data, then again, very rapidly, multidimensional vulnerability indices were created with the census or the registry data and used for household targeting. For example, in Honduras, they targeted the people by MVI for 260,000 inputs, depending on their profile of deprivations that could be income or education or biosafety equipment, etc. And lastly, in terms of COVID, a number of countries keep working, and some, including Afghanistan, have had ongoing data collection. Some have used rapid remote surveys Some have merged the MPI with health records data like Colombia. And so we've learned a lot about the data side and the new technologies and how to better use them, because we have to. You know, this is a terrible time, but you need to use data because fiscal resources are limited. So you want interventions to target the poorest. In terms of our website, there's a COVID section that has a lot of that information there, including work by Jacob on some of these overlaps of different indicators.
Thank you.
Thanks, Abdullah, and thanks, Sabina. For the probably last question, we'll see how long we take for this one. I'll hand it over to Sue.
Sorry, I'm so long. Are you telling me to be quick, Jacob?
Not at all, Sabina. I would never do that. Su Ming, please go ahead, unmute and ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me? I hope so. Yeah. Thank you so much, Sabina, for this really lovely talk, and also how you've discussed our colleagues' questions. So my question just comes from, feeling very warm, listening and connected to my colleagues, listening to your talk. And what made me warm and what struck me about everything that you said was this kind of value or deep perspective of humanity that came through at every level, from the philosophy underlying to the methods and the data. And I think this is really important to us as a community, and important to our interdisciplinarity and being able to cross the disciplines. But do you think that we tend to underemphasize this value of humanity in our research? Do you think it's problematic to state it too explicitly?
Very interesting question. I'd have to think more about it. But I think one observation I had was, it was years when I read Amartya Sen's work before I met him. But I would tell people, I was working on his work or researching his work. And something they all said is that it was positive. So they all said he's charming, he's appreciative, he's a good person. And I looked at that and I tried to understand, and you can sort of see why, that genuinely he appreciates colleagues' work, and he speaks largely, very positively. There have been some very clear clashes intellectually, but it's not at a personal level necessarily. And so I think that could be useful, because if you think, you can't overstate it, because people have their personalities and their ways of making things work. But it certainly is easier to collaborate with people who are like that. And I've been blessed to work with many. And there's just lower transaction costs. And yet I think in academia, we are reared, and our professional incentives are individual, single authored papers. What I've done, the research agreements I'm the PI on, my legacy, as it were. And those incentives are at odds with, in a sense, maybe the qualities that are quite useful in doing research. So you have to trade off and think about what will work for each person, and also their personalities. But one thing I've loved about the Capability Association, HDCA, is that it is certainly a place where people meet as people, and with the shared commitment sort of in the foreground. And I think for that reason, it's a very dynamic and fun place to share work.
Thank you for that. It's a very experiential perspective on humanity, and a kind of relational perspective. But again, it's not explicitly a value or clarifying what that humanity is, though you kind of know what it is when you see it, because you seem to equate it with good people.
I don't know. I mean, I read about Milton Friedman and von Hayek, and particularly von Hayek in Chicago. When he went there, they were yes people. And if you were old, you were right. And so that economics has a very aggressive persona, and that there's a lot of sarcasm. There's a lot of, point taking in seminars, and that's the culture. But where that came out of was the need that the ideas be right, and not that you kowtow to some professional because he or she are the senior in the field. And so, you know, that's also a good value. And that's also something that you want. You don't want people saying nice things and then the quality of your work goes down the tubes because you don't have, you know, very strong criticism and interchange. And so you see how subcultures develop and you see why they develop. And the question is how to do really high quality research. And is it possible to do without the culture that's been useful in terms of turning a profession to be focusing on the power of ideas?
Great, thanks Su-Ming and thanks Sabina. I think we actually do have time for one final question, for which I'll invite our colleague Kate to unmute and ask. And I'll have to ask both Kate and Sabina on this occasion to really be brief so that we can finish on time. Kate, over to you.
Thanks, Jacob, and thanks so much, Sabina, for a really excellent presentation. So my question draws on the points that you made at the very beginning of your presentation, that maybe the capabilities approach is falling out of favor a little bit as we move on. But at the same time, we are seeing these wellbeing measures and, you know, multidimensional poverty measures being much more implemented in governments throughout the world. And the global MPI, I think, is a really good example of that. So I was hoping you could perhaps draw on your many years of experience and provide some guidance to us on what we can do as advocates to advocate for the capability approach and advocate for wellbeing measures to be more implemented in government and in policy to kind of move things forward going into the future.
No, that's a great question. And I'll be brief, Jacob. When I started OPHI, we had lots and lots of ideas. And the co-founder of OPHI was John Hammack, who came from Oxfam, Women's World Banking Action Aid. And he said, look, if you do all of this, you're going nowhere. You know, a river has to be focused and narrow, and then it gathers force and then it can move a boulder. But if you have little driblets, it doesn't work. And so sort of against my nature, because I'm way too interested in way too many things, I focused, and it was the first time I had really. I think that what could be useful would be to set one or two goals collectively and say, look, what we would like is X, and use the tools of social organizing, you know, from the grassroots social organizers of having low-hanging fruit, the civil, you know, the grape or whatever. But what would be one clear win in well-being, or what would be one clear win in data? And those would be two, and then what would be after that? But if everybody did a little bit, there's enough to have real momentum. But I think what happens is that we all do our own thing, and I, you know, put myself in that category too. And I don't know how, none of us know how to come together. And I think that would be an interesting thing to try to crack. I think the thematic groups are one place, but we might be able to do it more widely somehow. And then the question is how, without being dogmatic, without, you know, all the negative stuff.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Sabina. We are good on time. I'll just hand over to Sebastian very quickly for a final wrap up. Thank you.
Yeah, that sounds excellent. All right. So on that note, then, I would like to just end this session by, again, thanking today's presenter, Sabina Alkire, for her many valuable reflections, both during the presentation and the Q&A. And of course, I also want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us, either by simply viewing, but also chatting and asking your questions in the Q&A box. I think that this session on the limitations and frontiers of the capability approach wraps up this webinar series in a very fitting way. I mean, the series started out with a focus on conceptual questions about what well-being is, and moved on to questions about methodological commitments when it comes to measuring whatever multidimensional well-being may be. And I think that this conceptual and methodological background then led us into a series of crucial discussions about ways of applying all of these sort of considerations from the theoretical background in practice. So with today's remarks in mind, these various theoretical and practical areas that have sort of come to the forefront have shown us how we can identify various challenges, but also opportunities that lie ahead for future research projects, and I think importantly, related policy applications. So thank you again for sharing your thoughts with us today, Sabina, and thanks to the audience. Beyond these closing words for the session, at this moment, I would also like to take the opportunity to just say some very brief concluding remarks about the webinar series as a whole. The first session was held in the beginning of April, and throughout the semester, we've had a run of 7 webinars in total, concluding with this one. Information about previous sessions is available on our website, 2021webinarseries.com, which contains a full list of speakers, abstracts, and related recordings. I hope that you feel very welcome to access the webinar series material from there, either for the first time or again, and to direct any questions you may have to the contact details that we list on the website. So the work on this webinar series started many months ago, even before the first session in April. And I, alongside a team of junior HDA scholars, basically wanted to create and nurture connections between people that do both theoretical and practical work on multidimensional well-being. So after reaching out to the larger graduate student network of the HDCA, a bunch of us started meeting regularly to try to turn this sort of idea into something more concrete. And as I happen to be the last voice being heard out of many important ones during this series, I'm happy to have the opportunity to sort of express my appreciation to both today's co-host, Jacob Dirksen, but also my colleagues, Travis Chamberlain, Raphael Eng, and Kate Solis. Besides those of us that I just mentioned doing sort of on-camera work alongside the webinar series presenters, several people have helped make this series a reality by working with us behind the scenes. And among these, I would like to mention Oscar Garza, Kathy Rosenblum, Jack Simpson, and Gareth Wall, who at several points were vital to spreading the news about the sessions and setting up the technical architecture for all of this. And the same amount of thanks go to our thematic group coordinators within the HDCA. Of course, as a last note, thanks again to all of you in the audience for attending the presentations and contributing to the discussions. I hope you have enjoyed your time with the series as much as we have. So while we have reached the end of this webinar series now, we may be working on other things in the future, including perhaps podcasts or further one-off webinars down the line. So if you'd like to learn about those, please do look out for an email from us or check the HDA website or indeed our website that was mentioned before. All right, that about wraps it up. Thank you again, Sabina. Thank you, Jacob. And thank you in the audience for joining us.